Well, hello everybody, and give me 1 second here. There we go. I got that format figured out. All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new series I'm starting here. It's my first time doing something like this, so bear with me. It could go a little extra long, or not be as in depth as maybe I'd like it to be. So this is going to be a series I'm looking to do. It's called the NFL Draft Redraft. And what I'm going to do is I've already got a few. So we're starting with the 1970 season. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at their first two rounds. And I'm going to say, well, in hindsight, how would they go and draft these based on how the teams or how the players end up performing in their careers. Now, of course, when you do something like this, it alters the course of everything. So, for example, take Terry Bradshaw. He was, of course, the number one overall pick in 1971 or 1970, sorry, by the Pittsburgh Steelers. So let's say, for example, I don't put him on the Steelers. Let's say I put him on the Saints. It alters his career. It alters the Steeler organization, of course. Alters everything. So if I was to do that, perhaps, he doesn't become a Hall of Fame player. He doesn't win 4 Super Bowls. The Steelers don't win 4 Super Bowls. Or perhaps the Steelers still win 4 Super Bowls. Perhaps Terry Bradshaw does win a few Super Bowls with the Saints. Lots of variables can come into play here. But this is something I know sometimes people do this, but they don't go back very far. So like I said, I'm starting with 1970. The reason I'm starting with 1970 is because that was the first year of the merger. So back in the late 60s, of course, there was the AFL and the NFL. And they were in bidding wars for players, draft picks. And they were trying to steal players. You'd have players, for example, Joe Namath. He was actually drafted by 2 teams. He was drafted by the Jets, and he was drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals. And the reason he went to the Jets is because they were willing to pay his contract demand. I believe he wanted $400,000. And as he says very humorously, when he told the Cardinals that he wanted $400,000 and a Lincoln Continental, and the owner, I guess, was $400,000 and a Lincoln Continental. Of course, the Cardinals didn't give him that, and the Jets did, and he ended up being really the linchpin for the merger, or at least he was one of the big factors. The 1968 Jet team beat the 1968 Colts team, who everyone thought were just going to roll over those Jets. And then, of course, shortly after that was when the merger was signed between both leagues. And then in 1969, they played the last of the AFL champion versus the NFL champion, which was the Chiefs, and they beat the Minnesota Vikings. So then we fast forward to the 1970. And in 1970, the AFL became the American Football Conference, and the NFL became the National Football Conference, but everything fell under the NFL umbrella. Back in 1970, there was only 26 teams at that time, so I'm only doing, like I said, I'm going to do the first 2 rounds. Sorry, I'm just looking up a few things I had saved here on my phone. Kind of wanted to give you guys, see if we can't find it. There we go. So the draft actually takes place in 1970. It takes place in late January. It was January 27th through the 28th. In the initial first days of the draft, they did not have a time limit. I believe there was one pick. It wasn't in this draft. I apologize. I don't remember the year. This just popped in my head. But it was, I believe, it was in the 60s. And I want to say it was the Rams. It was either the Rams or the Lions. And I think their draft pick took like 4 hours to be announced. I said things back then were a little bit different. So in this draft, you had Terry Bradshaw was the first overall pick. 4 Hall of Famers came out of this draft. Says here the longest lasting player was Mark Mosley, who was a kicker. He actually his biggest fame was he was NFL MVP in 1982 for the Redskins, and he helped them win the Super Bowl against the Dolphins, and then he ended up finishing his career with Cleveland. Yep, finished with Cleveland. So 1970, the NFL champions coming into the draft were the Kansas City Chiefs. I think I already mentioned that. So let's just get going here. So, like I said, this is a brand new format for me. I've never done something like this before. If I get off kilter, I do apologize for that. 1 second. Yes, more than 1 second. Because the one thing I did not write down here was I did want to say who the teams actually announced as I announced this. So who they took and then who I'm giving them. I have that pulled up right here. I got other stuff that I want to pull on the computer. That's why I'm not pulling this up on here. So let's get right into the 1970 NFL Draft redraft. And we're going to start with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the Pittsburgh Steelers, they end up selecting, in real life, they selected quarterback Terry Bradshaw. Of course, everyone knows he wanted to have a Hall of Fame career with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Took them to 4 Super Bowls before his career was unfortunately ended in early 1983. Which that'll be a lot of fun when we cover that one, because you may see one of those hindsight situations. You may see those Steelers drafting a little bit differently than they did in 1969. I'm sorry, 1983. But we're getting too ahead of ourselves here. So Terry Bradshaw, he ended up getting elbow injury in 83 and he retired. Of course, he's had a lot of success as an announcer with I believe Fox, and I think he had CBS before that. Beloved figure. He's a movie star. He's been in several movies. Some with Burt Reynolds, and I know he's one with Matthew McConaughey. But it's getting off kilter here. This isn't football related. So, anyway, end of the day, the Pittsburgh Steelers selected quarterback Terry Bradshaw. Now, like I said, I'm going to look at this and say, well, what did they have? So, here we go. So, in 1970, the roster that they had, they definitely did need a quarterback. When you look at what they had, they could have used a running back. They could have used receiver for sure, tight end. They did have Joe Green at this point. They did have Andy Russell. He was a big part of the first couple of Super Bowl championships, linebacker. But those were the big stars. They had a pretty solid offensive line overall. Ray Mansfield was their center for a long, long time. Not going to say he's a Hall of Fame player, but he was definitely a solid player for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Really was their team captain on offense for a long time. So, before I ramble on here about the Steelers. So when I looked at their team, like I said, in this draft I had 4 Hall of Famers. So in reality, the 4 Hall of Fame players should go first. Choices, of course, were Terry Bradshaw, which was their original pick. Could have went with Mel Blount with this pick, who of course ended up with the Steelers in the same draft later in the draft. Who I believe actually is the overall best player in this draft. There was safety Cliff Harris of the Cowboys, and center Jim Langer. And then of course there was other pretty solid players. There's 1 or 2 I'd say you could make an argument for the Hall of Fame for, but to get on with it, Pittsburgh Steelers, I'm going to still give them Terry Bradshaw, simply because I was tempted for Mel Blount. Mel Blount, I look at as definitely top 2 cornerback of all time. A lot of rules were changed because of Mel Blount as a cornerback. He was not someone that was increasingly fast. I mean, he wasn't like Deion Sanders where he was going to, just mask them. But physically, he would beat them up at the line. He would beat them up all over the field. He was a good tackler, strong hitter, bigger individual. I believe he's 6'2", 6'4", somewhere in there. 6'3". So, again, I consider him the greatest. I personally consider him the greatest corner of all time. But with that being said, again, I went with Terry Bradshaw just because of the success that they end up having down the road. And I still see with the dynamic of their team, with the coaching staff, and of course Bradshaw did have early struggles. At one point, Joe Gilliam was starting over him. This was a couple years down the road. He threw a lot of interceptions early, but then once you get to that second Super Bowl, the first Super Bowl, he was okay. He wasn't somebody I don't think you would say he was. Oh, he's a Hall of Fame player. You wouldn't have said that in 1974, but I think 75, definitely by 77. You were seeing it. 78 took it over the top. I mean, but a lot of that was in 78 is I think when they called it the Mel Blount rule, where the defensive backs were giving a lot less freedom when it came to covering wide receivers. So again, I'm going to stay with Pittsburgh, Terry Bradshaw as the first overall pick. Now, when it comes to the second overall pick, now we go to Green Bay. And Green Bay, they selected in 1970 defensive tackle Mike McCoy. McCoy played 10 solid years, 10 years, 11 seasons, however you want to look at it. Not all with Green Bay. Really didn't have I'd say a horrible career. He was more role player. He was never a dominating defensive presence, something that you would take at the second overall pick. When you look at the team that they still had Bart Starr. Of course, he was on his tail end at this point. Actually, I think 70 or 71 was his last year. Running back, they don't blow you away. This was pretty much the complete decline of the Packers. They still had some solid defensive players, but they were older. For example, you had Ray Nitschke. He was on his last year or two. You had Willie Wood. He was 34 at this point. Bob Jeter, who was a corner for him. They had Carroll Dale, who was a wide receiver. He was on, I believe, he was almost, I think, on his last year with them. He ended up playing, I think, for Minnesota shortly after this. And he was, for a long time, he was one of their legendary wide receivers. But for them, I'm going to give them, since, of course, like I said, Bob Jeter is getting to the point where he's aging out. We are going to draft for the 1970 Green Bay Packers cornerback, and the man I consider the best prospect in this draft, Mel Blount. Mel Blount, like I said earlier, was a game changer. A lot of rules were put in place because he was such a good defensive back. Very physical. He would have no problem, especially you're talking the NFC Central at this point. You're going against the Bears, who like to run the ball. At this time, Detroit pretty much everyone ran the ball. There wasn't much passing really going on back then. But he could really mix it up in there, and he'll hit you, he'll tackle you, and on top of that, if the ball comes his way, he's picking it off. So that's who I'm going with for Green Bay. Now we move to the third overall pick, and with the third overall pick, it's going to be Cleveland. And in 1970, they actually, now I'm not really getting into much of the trading here, but they actually drafted quarterback Mike Phipps. That was part of a deal they had with Miami, where they had traded away Hall of Fame wide receiver Paul Warfield to Miami, and they really were looking for Phipps here to come in and hopefully be their next Otto Graham. Phipps ended up playing to 1981. He didn't have a lot of success with the Browns. His last couple of years he played with Chicago. He actually helped lead them as more of a relief duty, but he came in for an injured Vince Evans in the 79 season for the Bears, and he helped get them to the NFC wildcard game. We played okay, but he, of course, wasn't the answer for them either. I look at him as a solid backup quarterback. That's what he was probably meant to be. He was not someone that was going to be a dominating starter in the NFL. So when I looked at the Cleveland Browns, they definitely needed a quarterback still. They were set at running back because they had Hall of Famer Leroy Kelly. They were okay at a wide receiver. You have Gary Collins there. Solid tight end and Milt Moran. They still had future Hall of Famer Gene Hickerson and Dick Sheriff. I'm sure I said that name wrong, but defensively, you're looking at people like Walter Johnson, solid outside linebacker Jimmy Houston. So they had definitely some pieces that they could still build around. So when I looked at their team, I was like, I looked at them. I wanted to add, being as Bradshaw was gone, I wanted to add defense to them, and I ended up giving them a Hall of Famer, future Hall of Famer, in free safety Cliff Harris. Cliff Harris was drafted by the Cowboys. Played with them all through the 70s. Was a part of 5 Super Bowls. 2 of them were wins. And really, could even argue there could have been 4 Super Bowl victories there. Really 5. The Cowboys could have swept all their Super Bowls. They lost by a field goal, and there's some people believe that really they got screwed on a goal line call against the Colts later this year in the 1970 season. Now I'm getting off the path again. So let's talk about Cliff Harris. Cliff Harris, he would definitely, for that decade of the 70s, have been the defensive leader, I think, looking at what they end up having over the decade. He would have been the leader of that secondary for sure, if not the entire defense. Very intelligent player, very respected. He had no problem getting in your face in the 1975 Super Bowl against the Steelers after a missed field goal by Roy Jarella. He actually kind of started patting him on the head a little bit, and Jack Lambert took him and threw him down, and flags were flown on that one for unsportsmanlike conduct. But again, he had no problem. If he had to get dirty, he would get dirty. Definitely a player that was intelligent. He can step in front of. He can read deep. He can read the offense pretty well. Step in front. He will make a pick. More importantly, good tackler, very good tackler. So, which most safeties back in the 70s were. So, again, I'm going to give Cliff Harris to the Cleveland Browns. So now we move on to the 4th pick, and this would be, of course, back then they were called the Boston Patriots. Just 2 years later, or maybe it was 1 year later that they became the New England Patriots. So we'll just call them New England Patriots, but back then they were still Boston. And here they selected in real life they selected defensive tackle Phil Olsen. Looking at their roster, they could have used a young quarterback. Running back was a question. There was a lot of questions on this team. I'd say their strong points were offensive line, especially interior offensive line. Defensively, they definitely need secondary help, linebacker help. They had a couple. They had a couple good guys up front. Jim Lee Hunt and Houston Antwine, but they were both older players in their early 30s at that point. So where I went with them was, now there was one Hall of Famer still left, but they had center John Morris, who was 28, well-established center for them. I didn't look at that as a need position, and he was there for I think 4 or 5 more years, I believe. So what I did was I went with Cliff Harris's teammate from Dallas, and I gave him a guy that I think is a fringe Hall of Fame player. He was a vital part, another intelligent player, very good interceptor. He started out as a cornerback, and then he ended up moving to the safety position where he really flourished. He was a strong safety in that doomsday defense for Landry's Cowboys, and he's actually been called Tom Landry's favorite player. And that's safety Charlie Waters. So I'm going to give Charlie Waters to the Boston Patriots, and I think he would have been that leader for the defensive backfield in the 70s. And this team actually defensively through the decade got better. They end up, of course, adding in the mid to upper 70s. They added Mike Haynes, who I would definitely put in top 5 corners of all time. Definitely top 10, potentially top 5. But I look at him as he would have been the catalyst for that defense to start, for that rebuilding of that secondary. And he ended up playing all the way to, 81? 81 was his last year, Charlie Waters. So that was another thing I looked for when I did this, just so you guys all know. I looked for guys that had longevity as well. And definitely Charlie Waters had it. He had 1 year where he kind of semi-retired. In 79, actually became a broadcaster for the Cowboys. And then he returned in the 1980 season. So next we're going to go to Buffalo. And in Buffalo, in the real draft, they selected defensive end Al Cowlings. I'm sure a lot of you may remember that name. So when we look at the Bills of 1970, look, their bread and butter was O.J. Simpson. They built everything around him, but at this point, they were still rebuilding it because they didn't have defensively. They weren't solid. The Bills had a very good 1960s units. They were one of the better AFL teams throughout the 60s. So at this point, they were rebuilding. In 1969, they drafted O.J., number 1 overall. And, I'm sorry, was that 68? Nope, it was 69, so I thought. They drafted him, and that's where they built everything around him. So, but at this point, they need a quarterback. Now, I will say this individual is not getting drafted today, but Dennis Shaw, they drafted him in the draft, and quarterback. He ended up being the rookie of the year. His stats were not very good. I mean, he would be replaced in about 3 years from this by Joe Ferguson. So, but really, from a quarterback standpoint, there wasn't a quarterback that I could really draft for them. If Bradshaw had fallen, of course, Bradshaw would have gone in this spot. So looking at them, they had Marlon Briscoe, who was a Pro Bowl receiver. You had a young Haven Moses, who ended up being, he's another player, I think, Haven Moses is a borderline, at least he's in the argument, I think, for contention for the Hall of Fame. There's so many of those receivers from the 60s and 70s that deserve to go in, and I hate that their stats don't look the same. Sometimes you can't look at stats for everything. Their offensive line, they could have definitely improved the offensive line here in 1970. Defensively, you had defensive end Ron McDowell. He was getting up there in years. He was at 31. This is probably why they drafted Al Cowlings, because he'd play on the other side of McDowell that year. So at least you had a young defensive end to hopefully learn from your one of your legends at that time. They had solid linebacker, for example, Mike Stratton. I know Robert James, Butch Bird were pretty good cornerbacks for them. So we're actually going to go with them. We're going to, since you have OJ, and you want to make sure that you're good with OJ, and we know years down the line they're going to add some solid future Hall of Fame offensive linemen. We're going to give them right now, and we're going to give them the last Hall of Famer in this class, and that's Jim Langer. He was the center, of course, for the Miami Dolphins and their championship teams of 72 and 73. And many would definitely consider him, for sure, a top. You can make the argument for top 10 center of all time, definitely top 15. And I love Jim Langer, but thing is, he's not even as great of a player as he was. He's not even the best Dolphins center of all time. Of course, that's Dwight Stevenson, my opinion. But again, getting that Jim Langer in here to lead that offensive line for the decade of the 70s, I think is huge. And he ended up playing, I believe, until 1979 or 80 was his last year. I want to say 80. But Langer would be a great leader for that offensive line after they add, of course, Don Malier down the road. After they add Reggie McKenzie down the road. I mean, talk about an intense offensive line for OJ. OJ may have gotten more than what he did in, 73 when he was the first player ever to get 2,000 plus yards. So again, I'm giving Buffalo Jim Langer. So now we get into the next pick, which is the Philadelphia Eagles. And the Eagles in 1970, this is the 6th overall pick, they selected linebacker Steve Zabel. Steve Zabel played until 1979. It really wasn't much of a presence. Went around from kind of team to team. Played for 4 different teams in his career. He had Philly, New England, Baltimore, and I'm sorry, he only played for 3 teams. I looked at this wrong. He must have changed his number one year or something. But he never really lived up to his draft position. Played in 124 games, starting 95 of them. Because it's not horrible. There are other, I guess, worse stats that some people might have as far as games played. But Steve Zabel is not even going to get drafted in these first 2 rounds. He probably would have gone in the 3rd round if I would have kept going. So let me pull the Eagles starters up here real quick. By the way, I'm using Pro Football Reference. If you want to get football knowledge, or if you want to learn about the history of the sport, or at least from the NFL standpoint, Football Reference is a great avenue, a great tool to use. I use it anytime I want to look up anything. One thing I like to do, and I know I'm getting off base here, but one thing I like to do is I take Madden. I like to turn it into an all-time thing. So not just a season I like to take it and actually create all-time teams for each organization. And a lot of times I use this Football Reference, ProFootballReference.com, as my main tool to distinguish how am I going to rate these players. So, looking at them in 1970, of course, they had quarterback Norm Snead, who was on his upper end. Harold Jackson, who was young at this point, but he ended up being one of the best receivers of the 70s. He was up there at least. Offensive line, definitely could have used improvement. Defensively, not a lot of studs on his defense. Let's put it that way. This tells you, I think, though, Steve Zabel, this was a bad defense. The Eagles as a whole, until 76, they started the turn, because that's when they brought in Vermeil. By 78, they had turned the corner. Of course, by 80, they went to a Super Bowl. But in this place, I'm going to give them a guy who I think deserves placement. in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and that is defensive tackle Jerry Shirk. Jerry Shirk played until I think '82. The Cleveland. He played his entire career with the Cleveland Browns. I mean, he's definitely one of their greatest defensive tackles of all time. He did have some injury issues at the end of his career, but excuse me, he was one of their leaders defensively for a long, long time. And he would have been that on this Eagles team. He would have been a player you put in there. He would have started from day one, and they could have built a defensive front around this man. And that could have been the start of the Eagle turnaround. So, again, I'm giving Jerry Shirk, defensive tackle, to Philadelphia at the 6th position. Now, in the 7th position, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, the Bengals, of course, a lot of people like to make... In the 70s, the Bengals actually did have some solid seasons. But they were never consistent. And, of course, here in 1970, they won their division. They still had Paul Brown coaching for them. But when you look at this 1970 team, I mean, their quarterback wasn't very good, and Virgil Carter. They were more of a running team. You had Paul Robinson, who was a solid running back. He didn't play for a very long time, but he was a solid player when he played. They had Bob Trumpy, who was a Pro Bowl tight end. I think at one point he could have had Trumpy in the mix for potential tight end Hall of Fame players. Offensive line, they had a young Bob Johnson, who was their center for a long, long time. So they definitely didn't need center. By the way, they drafted Mike Reed here, and he only played to 74. He does get drafted here with us today, and he was the one exception that was a younger player, or didn't play very long. He was a great player for when he played. He was a Pro Bowl player for when he played. But injuries caught up with him, unfortunately. But you still look up. There are people that will say Mike Reed is the greatest defensive tackle the Cincinnati Bengals have ever had. So, looking at this lineup they have, actually 3 rookies from their team made their starting defense for this 1970 team. And all 3 of these individuals will get drafted today. But you look at their defense was solid. You had Bill Bergey. Of course, he ends up going to Philadelphia, but he had a lot of good years with Cincinnati. Bill Bergey was a leader. Another individual I think you could make an argument for the Hall of Fame as well. They had Ken Riley. He just went in the Hall of Fame as cornerback. They definitely could have used safety help. So what I decided to do is, like I said, they drafted Mike Reed on here, but he only played to 74. So the individual I'm going to get him played a little bit longer than that. Lamar Parrish is who I'm giving him, who they did draft anyways. He got drafted a little bit earlier, and him and Ken Riley were a good combination at corner. And when you just try to think about, and plus now that Parrish was one of the dominant return men in the 70s as well. So he brings a lot of value to this team. And he played into the upper side. I think 80 might have been his last year. So yeah, again, I'm giving him Lamar Parrish. So from there we go to the number 8 position. And in 8 we have now everyone's going to know him as the Arizona Cardinals. Back then they were known as the St. Louis Cardinals. And in 1970, they drafted running back Larry Stegen. Running back Larry Stegen. He only plays he plays 1 year with them. So we're definitely not having him get drafted here. Shoot, I pulled up the wrong thing. Hold on 1 second, folks. Okay, this is the one I want. So looking at their roster, which again I did not pull it up right. Let's see if this one will work. Sometimes if you put it in wrong, it'll bring up like a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'm looking for I want their starters. So for the 1970 team, they got Jimmy Hart at quarterback. They could have used a running back, but they got a pretty solid fullback in MacArthur Lane. Wide receiver, they have Joe Gilliam at this point. Future Hall of Fame tight end Jackie Smith. You had, of course, Ernie McMillan at tackle. Irv Good was a solid guard for him. Defensively, Larry Stallings was a Pro Bowl player for him, leader of the defense. Future Hall of Famer Roger Worley, future Hall of Famer Larry Wilson were both in the secondary, corner and safety respectively. So when I looked at them, again, they did take a running back, which they needed, but he didn't really help their team out. So I gave him a position that I also felt needed as well. Like I said, they have Irv Good. He was 30 at this point. And the other guy, Clyde Williams, on the other side at guard, he was also 30. McMillan was 32. Bob Reynolds, 31. Their center was the only position that was young, and he doesn't even end up being their center much longer. So, because they actually end up drafting their other center in this draft, who ends up being their offensive line captain for a long, long time, and that was Tommy Banks, but we'll get to him in a minute. So here, for St. Louis, I'm going to draft for them guard Doug Wilkerson. And Doug Wilkerson played his career with the San Diego Chargers, was a stalwart for more than a decade. He played into the early 80s for them. And just a solid pick for the Cardinals here. Looking down the road, of course, they're going to add Dan Deerdorf. You're going to add a Conrad Dobler. This could have been one of the most dominant, with Wilkerson mixed into what the other names I'm throwing out there, like a Tom Banks. This would have been, of course, well, I guess they wouldn't have Tom Banks because I'm changing that. But with Doug Wilkerson would have been a tremendous pick for them and the future of their offensive line. So, again, I went with Doug Wilkerson, guard, to the Cardinals. Okay, so next up we have the San Francisco 49ers. Now, in the early 70s, the 49ers were actually one of the better teams in the league. That's where the Cowboy rivalry actually kind of began. But in this case, when we look at their team, so they drafted in real life defensive end Cedric Hardman, who ended up playing a long time for them. Hardman actually played in the league till 81, but he did play a little bit. I think at the very end he played for the Raiders, I believe. But when you look at their team, offensively they were pretty solid. Yeah, they could have used a better running back, but offensive line was pretty good. They had John Brody was one of the best quarterbacks, definitely through the early 70s. Young Gene Washington was a very underrated wide receiver for them. And defensively, they still had Tommy Hart, Charlie Kruger, nasty player. Both of them are solid, great players for a long, long time. They had the Intimidator, linebacker, Dave Wilcox. You had future Hall of Famer, of course, Wilcox, future Hall of Famer, cornerback Jimmy Johnson. And they also had solid safety in Mel Phillips. For them, though, they had Frank Nunley at middle linebacker, and he was an okay player, but I think they could have had an upgrade there. And I actually went linebacker for them to pair off with Dave Wilcox and really just hammer out this defense and make it even stronger. I gave them linebacker Jack Reynolds. Reynolds played the entire 70s with the Los Angeles Rams. And then he actually ended up playing for the 49ers in 81. He was on both their 81 and 84 Super Bowl team. And he was the leader of those defenses. So, I mean, there's no reason that he wouldn't have played his entire career as a 49er. The way I look at it, they call him the Hacksaw. He was a nasty player. Who was it? Was it Ronnie Lott or was it Randy Cross? Said that he would actually dress from the. They'd go to breakfast. The man would be dressed in his full uniform. He was ready to play. So I look at that as a solid selection for them, and could have really been the leader for those Niners defenses in the 70s. So next up we go to the New Orleans Saints, and they drafted wide receiver Ken Burrow. Kenny Burrow ends up having most of his successes with the Oilers. He played until 1981, and for a long time, you could say Kenny Burrow's another completely underrated player. Another one of those individuals who would stretch the field. Of course, the next year the Oilers would add Dan Pastorini. He could just throw the ball down the field to Ken Burrow. Ken Burrow was tall, lengthy, had good solid speed too. So you get the ball down the field to him, that many people are going to outjump Ken Burrow. But and I did actually debate keeping him here. Because he was that good. However, looking at the Saints lineup, of course, they had brought in an older Billy Kilmer, and running back wasn't very good at this point. They still had Danny Abramovich, who was their first most dominant receiver they had. Solid receiver for them for a long time. Offensive line was aging. And the ones that were younger weren't as good. Defensively, though, they could have used help defensively as well. You got Dave Rowe, who was a young defensive tackle. He was an okay player. Their defense did not stand out. This was a struggle for me because this was a team that I wish there would have been. This would have been a great place for Shirk to go. This would have been a great place for Reynolds to go. But I went offensive line for them with the mindset of, maybe they could build on this offensive line through the 70s. So I gave them center Tom Banks. And Tom Banks played for the Cardinals his entire career, was the leader for that team, and was just a great player for a long time. Pro Bowl player. Helped stabilize that offensive line through the mid-70s when those Cardinals teams were going to playoffs. Again, he's a leader. And so hopefully that would be a player that the Saints could have, looked at. Well, we got this. We build some other offensive line around him. And then hopefully we can get ourselves a solid running back down the road. Of course, we find out that doesn't happen for a very, very long time. The Saints were not very good. And of course, the next year they would draft Archie Manning. Because Billy Kilmer was ended up going to go to Washington. So now we are going to go out to Denver. And in Denver, the 1970 Broncos, they drafted running back Bobby Anderson. He played 5 years in the league. I don't really know why they drafted him, to be honest, because you had Floyd Little. Floyd Little wasn't really old at this point. He was 28. Still had a few years left in him, for sure. I think he retires in 75. Could be wrong on that. Could have been 74, but I'll say it was 75. So I looked at the Denver team. They had Floyd Little. They had a few offensive line pieces. I could have gone offensive line here. I could have gone wide receiver here. There wasn't a quarterback to go, so I didn't go quarterback. So what I actually ended up giving them was building on what the strength of their 70 team was, and that was its defense. I mean, you have another guy I would consider an underrated player, someone that is a Hall of Fame quality player in Rich Tombstone Jackson. You had a solid defensive tackle in Paul Smith, who was young at that point. They definitely needed linebacking help. And they had a young Billy Thompson At this point, he was corner. He ends up moving to safety. He was a great player for them for into the early 80s. So I gave them defense, a guy that would have just actually had drafted in real life a couple spots earlier, but I gave him defensive end Cedric Hardman. And Hardman paired with Jackson would have been a nasty combination at defensive ends. Solid player. He played to 81. He was on I think he was on one of those. He was on the 1980 Raiders Super Bowl team. So I think he would have really helped improve that defense. Next up, we have Atlanta. And in real life, the Atlanta Falcons at number 12 are going to draft defensive tackle John Small, who plays a small part in their organization because he only plays 4 years. These Falcons teams were bad overall. The only thing you really had is you had a young Jeff Van Noe who played into the early 80s at center, actually almost into the mid-80s. You had tackle George Kuntz, who played for them. It was a solid tackle, actually. He played for them for, I think, half his career. I think he played for them for 6 years. And then he went and had a pretty solid career with the Colts. You had future Hall of Famer Clyde Humphrey on defense. John Zook was a solid defensive end as well. You had another guy that should be in the Hall of Fame. That's middle linebacker Tommy Nobis. You had Ken Reeves at corner. He was a solid player for them. So when I looked at him, like, okay, let's upgrade the offense here. And now this is another one of those players that didn't play very long. His ended up becoming a contract issue. He was a key player, though, for the 1971 Dallas Cowboys, winning the Super Bowl. So I gave them, thinking that maybe they'll pay the guy and he'll play longer. And that was running back Dwayne Thomas. Dwayne Thomas was a very solid running back for Dallas early on. And again, there was some contract issues. But Dallas was known to be cheap in the 70s. We're not talking Jerry Jones, okay? This was the Tex Stram Cowboys. And he did not want to play players. He didn't care if you were Bob Lilly. You weren't making a lot of money on those early 70s, late 70s Cowboys team under Tom Landry. But I think this would have been a player that they would have paid, and I think he would have, I don't know if he would have been a Hall of Fame player, but he would have been probably played a little bit longer, and he would have had a solid career for them, I believe. So next up, we're going to go to the New York Giants. And the New York Giants in 1970 drafted linebacker Jim Files. He played all the way to 1973. So here, looking at their team, they had Fran Tarkenton at this point. Of course, he's only going to be with them for a couple more years because he's going back to Minnesota. You had a young Ron Johnson who was a 1,000-yard running back for him. So they did not need a running back. Offensive line could have definitely been improved for sure. Defensively, you had a young Fred Dreyer, defensive end. Bob Lertzma wasn't too bad a player. Matt Heiseltine he actually was a Niner at one point, and this was at the very end of his career. He played for the Giants. Spider Lockhart, many people remember him. He was a great safety for the Giants in those through the late 60s, early 70s. So I decided to go offensive line for them, and I gave them center Rich Saul. Rich Saul played, he played I think until about 80, 81, somewhere in there, for the Rams. He was on their Super Bowl team in 79, was the leader of that offensive line. It included such great players like Tom Mack, Jackie Slater. Who else was on there? Dennis Hara, Kent Hill. So I thought, well, we'll give them, and maybe this would help keep Fran Tarkenton around if they did this, and this would help Ron Johnson have a more productive team, and hopefully just build them an offensive line around a great center like Rich Saul. So next up, we're going to have the Houston Oilers. And in 1970, the Houston Oilers, they selected Doug Wilkerson, who I talked about earlier. He's already gone. He ended up playing for most of his career for San Diego, but he was drafted by, and then he was traded away to, I believe he was traded. He may have been released, but either way, he makes his way to San Diego and had a great career. At this point, though, you look at these Oilers, they definitely could have used a quarterback. Running back wasn't very good. They did have a future Hall of Famer at wide receiver named Charlie Joyner, but he's very short for a Houston career because he's about to go to Cincinnati. Their offensive line wasn't horrible. It was aging, but probably could survive, at least for a year or two. Defensively, you had a future Hall of Famer, Elvin Bethea. Of course, he was there until like 81. You still had future Hall of Famer safety Ken Houston. They had Pro Bowler Zeke Moore at corner. So what I did was I decided, you know what, let's give him another corner. And we'll give him the guy that actually won the Rookie of the Year for defense in 1970, who was drafted by San Francisco. But I'm going to give him cornerback Bruce Taylor. Bruce Taylor played until 77 for the Niners. And when he retired, he was one of their leaders, I believe, as a career in interceptions. Solid corner through his 8 seasons in the NFL. I'm going to try to speed this up a bit. I'm just realizing how long I'm starting to go on this. So I'm going to try not to talk too much as I'm going here, especially when I get into the second round. Those I'll just kind of name, I'll just say a few words. So now we're going to move on to the Chargers. They drafted Walker Gillette, wide receiver. Looking at their team, they still had John Hadel at quarterback, so they're solid there. They still had future Hall of Famer Lance Allworth, who some consider one of the top 10 greatest wide receivers of all time. So they had a solid offensive line. You had Russ Washington. You had Walt Sweeney at guard. And defense is where they definitely needed help for sure. So I'm going to improve their safety position, and they're going to get Jake Scott. Jake Scott, he ended up being the Super Bowl, the 1972 Super Bowl MVP for the Dolphins. Very, very quiet player, very smart player, and he'll jump in front, he'll pick it off. So I think this would be someone that they could have. The Chargers had struggles in the defensive position, in the defense throughout the 70s until the late 70s. They did add some firepower there, but so now we're going to move on to Green Bay. Green Bay at 16, they took tight end Mitch McGeorge. He played a 78, had a solid career for him. But we're going to actually improve another position for him. And I'm just trying to picture this because he would have had Bart Starr for a little while, and then he would get Lynn Dickey. But they're getting wide receiver Ken Burrow, who again earlier I said I would consider him a fringe Hall of Fame wide receiver. At least he's in the discussion in my mind. A lot of those 70s receivers are in the discussion in my mind. But so I'm going to give him Kenny Burrow, and I'm just trying to picture Ken Burrow, and then you get, 7 years down the road, adding James Lofton. That would have been a deadly, deadly combination. But again, Kenny Burrow to the Green Bay Packers. Now we're going to go to the San Francisco 49ers again. And here I'm going to, and like I said, had injury issues. But this is one of those scenarios where different situation, he might not have the same injury situation. So by the way, they drafted at this position, they drafted Bruce Taylor here in real life, who would just, of course, in this draft, he already went. So I'm going to give him defensive tackle Mike Reed. And again, they had an aging defensive line. Charlie Krieger still had a year or two, I think, in him, but at that point he was pretty old, pretty beat up. Niner legend, really. But again, I'm going to give him Mike Reed with the hope that the injury bug does not bite him in San Francisco. So now we're going to move on to Baltimore. They took running back Norm Bulash. Bulash played for a while. He played to 79. And you may see him get mentioned in one of these first 2 rounds. But here, at this point, we looked at that aging defensive line. They had an aging quarterback, but there's no quarterback you're going to take at this point. So I gave them defensive tackle Doug Sutherland. Sutherland had, he was part of that the Purple People Eaters. He was Gary Larson's replacement, next to Alan Page, who some consider the greatest defensive tackle of all time. Definitely one of the smartest defensive tackles of all time, if not the smartest. But, yeah, Doug Sutherland is who I'm going to put here with the mindset of they could build that defensive line. And they did have some solid defensive talent in the 70s, the later 70s. So this would have been your guy. I mean, you would have had mixed in here with a Mike Curtis still. Ted Hendricks was young. What else? We got safety Jerry Logan was a solid player. Rick Volk. And he could have, this would have been your Billy Ray Smith replacement. I mean, you had Bubba Smith next to this guy. So they would have had a pretty solid defense here. It would have been a good ad, I think, for them. Next up, we're going to go to Detroit. And I'm not going to probably do this when I go, just so you know, I'm not going to be going over everyone's roster when I go to the second round. Although I did do this when I actually drafted it. I made sure I looked at what I gave them, what they had still. So with the Lions pick in real life, the Detroit Lions took running back Steve Owens. Steve Owens was a Heisman Trophy winner. Actually he only played a few years, but didn't have a bad career for the 4 years that he played. Well, 5 seasons, 4 years, however you want to look at it. So I ended up looking at their team, and I thought they needed defense. You had you had a young Lem Barney. So the Lions, sorry, I was going to say Niners. The Lions were known for their defensive backs throughout the 60s and 70s. You know, Lem Barney was young here. Dick LeBeau was getting old. He was on his tail end. So we're going to replace Dick LeBeau, or at least we're going to bring in Dick LeBeau's replacement with cornerback Ken Ellis. Ken Ellis played for the Green Bay Packers, was a solid Pro Bowl player for them. And we just think here that putting him with Lem Barney, you know, that would have been a deadly combination at the defensive back position. Next up, we have Cleveland. Cleveland's already drafted here. They got safety Cliff Harris early. In real life, I'm sorry, I missed. So the number 20 overall was actually the Jets. In real life, the Jets already drafted, didn't they? They did not. I was thinking of the Giants. Get those two always confused, I guess. So let's pull them up real quick. All right, so 1970, of course, you have Namath there. But Namath was hurt at this point, so but you're not going to draft a quarterback. Not that there was one to be had anyways. Still had Emerson Boozer at running back. You still had future Hall of Famer Don Maynard. George Sawyer was a solid receiver for him. You had future Hall of Famer Winston Hill at tackle. John Schmidt was a solid player. Dave Herman. They had a solid offensive line. And it was in their upper 20s, but it wasn't horrible in age. So I went out to them. I looked at their defense. And they weren't really an incredibly old defense, but there was a couple positions I thought could get improved. And that was very specifically the defensive end position. And we're looking to bring in Otis Sistrunk. He actually was an undrafted player for the Raiders. Played with them. He was on their 76 championship team. He was nasty player, but he would be a good fit here, and it would have been a good for the defense for the Jets. just so you guys know, I kind of hate doing this by myself. I wish I had someone to talk to. I think it'd be more productive if I had someone to actually talk to. But it is what it is. So now we're going to talk about the number 21 pick, which was Cleveland. In real life, the Cleveland Browns selected tackle Bob McKay. He played to 78. Not all for the Colts, but he played to 78. We're going to replace him with another offensive line player who actually ends up, he ends up being a Colt. But that's Ken Mendenhall. And he was pretty solid center for him, really, for the Colts in those 70s. Of course, he was the leader for that offensive line, blocking for Burt Jones in a few years. But we look at him and the offensive line for Cleveland, and they would not have had to draft Tom DeLone in a year or two. So this would have been their restructure for their offensive line. So we added them, and then we also, of course, added the safety earlier. Next up, we're going to have the Rams. The Rams drafted Jack Reynolds. Of course, he's already gone for us, and that's the position. Though we're going to stay with that linebacker position, and we're going to give him Gerald Irons, who played most of his career with the Raiders. In Oakland. Solid linebacker. He's an outside, not an inside guy. But he actually could pick it off and take it to the house. Also another nasty player. If you ever watched he's one of the guys chasing Bradshaw during that infamous Immaculate Reception. Next up, we're going to have Dallas. Now, Dallas, in real life, this is where they drafted Dwayne Thomas. In our draft, he went to Atlanta. So for 1970, we were going to upgrade their tight end position and give them Raymond Chester. Raymond Chester played for a couple teams. He played for the Raiders. He played for the Oilers. Was actually one of those tight ends that he was kind of prototype, really, because he could stretch the field. Back then, not many tight ends could. Tall, fast player. Something that seems like would have been a good addition for those early 70 teams before they added Drew Pearson. And I could see him catching some balls from Roger Staubach. Speaking of tight end, we're going to go to Oakland. And in real life, the Oakland Raiders in 1970 drafted, believe it or not, Raymond Chester. So we're going to replace that with Rich Castor, who played most of his career with the Jets. He actually was a player that could go to wide receiver as well. Both these players are very similar to each other. But yeah, Castor, sometimes, depending on the coach, sometimes he was a tight end, sometimes he was a receiver. He's another guy that could go down the field, had some good speed to him as well. Next up, we have the Minnesota Vikings, who took guard John Ward. We're going to give him tight end Bob Tucker. Bob Tucker played for the Giants in the 70s. He was the complete opposite of the other two. Good blocker. Solid catch guy, though. I mean, he didn't drop many balls. He actually was their tight end leader for receptions for a very long time. But yeah, Bob Tucker. And finally, we're going to go to your world champion Kansas City Chiefs, who they took in 1971 with their first overall pick, center Sid Smith. Sid Smith would be short for this world because in real life, they end up down the road adding that later this draft are going to add center Jack Rudney, and that's who we're giving him right here. We're giving him the guy they end up. We just got him a little bit sooner than where they drafted him in real life. And he played a solid. And then his son actually ends up playing for him in the early 80s. So again, Jack Rudney was the end of the first round. Now in the second round, this one I'm not going to spend as much time with unless it's a player that really deserves it. So now we're going to go to Dallas, had the first pick of the second round. They took tackle Bob Asher. I gave them defensive back Tim Foley. Tim Foley played for the Dolphins in the 70s, was a part of those 2 Super Bowl champion teams. He played all the way to, I think, 1980. Very smart player. Wasn't someone you were going to fool. He wasn't the fastest guy in the world, but he made up for it intelligence. Next up, we have Pittsburgh. Of course, they've already taken Terry Bradshaw. In real life, they drafted here Ron Shanklin, wide receiver. He had a good career for Pittsburgh, but that's not who we're giving him here. We're going to go with their guard position. We're going to give him Ron Saul, who's Rich's brother, who went earlier, of course. Just a young guard for him that had a solid career. He played into the early 80s as well for Washington. We have Miami now up next. We actually gave Miami, so in real life they took tight end Jim Mandich here. I'm giving him cornerback Curtis Johnson because the cornerback market at this point was pretty well depleted, and I was kind of worried about that one getting taken soon. So I gave him cornerback Curtis Johnson, who played for Miami, and he was part of those championship teams as well, and he played all the way up to the end of the 70s. Next up, Buffalo took quarterback Dennis Shaw, who, again, I mentioned he actually was the Rookie of the Year in 1970. But he only played with them until 75. At that point, they had brought in Joe Ferguson. So we're going to give him tight end Stu Vaught. And he had a very lengthy career for Minnesota. Great blocker, solid catch guy, very similar to Bob Tucker. Tucker was a better receiver, though. Vaught was more a blocker, but it was probably worth the position for Buffalo to take him. He could have gotten some catches, and he would have really helped out OJ. Next up, we have Houston. They took defensive tackle Lee Brooks. We're going to give him defensive end Joe Turkey Jones. And Joe Turkey Jones, he played for the Cleveland Browns in the 70s, and some of you may have seen the infamous shot. It was in, I think, 77 or 78 season where he ragdolls Terry Bradshaw bad. I mean, he like picked him up and just body slams him to the ground. And he didn't have his... he was a solid pass rush guy, but his numbers weren't consistent. He had a couple years where he was dominant, but then most of his career wasn't as very dominant. So, maybe going to Houston, teaming him with Elvin Bethea, they could have had something going there, and that team would end up adding Curly Culp down the line. That could have been a very dominant defensive line. Next up, we have wide receiver Ron Shanklin going to Cincinnati. Cincinnati, in real life, drafted defensive tackle Ron Carpenter. Shanklin had some good numbers for Pittsburgh early on in his career. And of course, if he goes here to Cincinnati, we're going to know in a year or two, I think in 2 years, they're going to add, I think it was 1 year, 71, they're going to add Kenny Anderson. So, especially in some of those Bill Walsh-led offenses with Cincinnati, because he was the offensive coordinator under Paul Brown. Many people they always give Bill Walsh. Paul Brown was really the original West Coast offense. Ron Shanklin to Cincinnati, and then you look him also. If he could play longer, you would have him paired. He played at 76, but who knows? Maybe he plays longer in Cincinnati. You pair him with an Isaac Curtis, who would have been young at that point at the end of his career. So that could have been a good combination. Next up, we have St. Louis. In real life, they took linebacker Jim Cordial, who did not play in the NFL. This is our first player that did not play in real life, that did not play in the league. So I'm going to draft for them linebacker Jim Carter. Jim Carter played for Green Bay in the 70s. He played for a couple other teams. Solid linebacker. And nothing that's going to blow you off the page, but just he's going to give you a solid output every day. Next up, we have Philadelphia. In real life, they took Ray Jones, who was a defensive back. He only played 3 seasons. We're going to give him instead, we're going to upgrade their tight end position. because we know right now they have Norm Snead at quarterback, and they're gonna be adding Roman Gabriel. So Rich McGeorge had a pretty solid tight end. Not a Hall of Fame career, not someone that was gonna light the world on fire, but he would block and he could get some good catches. So Rich McGeorge going to Philadelphia, second round. Next up, we have the Rams. Real life, they took wide receiver Donnie Williams. We're going to replace Ronnie Williams here with defensive tackle Ron Carpenter. Of course, earlier, I forgot who I gave him earlier in the draft. They got Gerald Iron, so we're improving that defense yet again. And maybe he could have been a part of that front four, that infamous front four. He would have been playing right next to Merle Olsen. And at this point, they still had Deacon Jones, but not much longer. Next up, we have Cleveland. And this is actually where Cleveland took Turkey Jones in real life. He's already gone in ours, so we're going to give Cleveland defensive tackle Bill Brundage. He didn't start a lot of games. He was a big pass rusher for Washington, though. And he played on the 72 team for Washington. And he had a solid career. I think he was he had 70 plus sacks for a career. Next up, we have Denver. They took defensive end Eldon Roush, who played to 78. He's actually a solid defensive player. You're going to see him mentioned here a little bit. Instead, we're going to upgrade their tight end position. They're going to get tight end Jim Mandich, who played for those Dolphins championship teams. Good blocker, solid receiver. Next up, we got St. Louis. In real life, they took guard Chuck Hutchinson. He only played 5 seasons for him. We're going to give him running back Jim Otis. Otis had an okay career. He actually was drafted, I believe, by the Saints, but ends up playing for the Cardinals. So we just got him to St. Louis a little bit faster. But he was more of a fullback than he was a running back. So if you ever look at his thing, he'll say both, but in reality, he was more of a fullback than a running back. The 13th pick of the second round, we have Atlanta. And Atlanta, in real life, took running back Art Malone, another name you may hear shortly. But we're going to give him cornerback Mark Washington. Mark Washington played for Dallas, mostly for Dallas in the 70s. He was a part of those early Tampa Bay teams in the late 70s. Solid cornerback. Unfortunately, he was a good cornerback, but a lot of people will remember him for the 75 Super Bowl against the Steelers. All of Lynn Schwann's big catches, the ones where they're like these acrobatic catches, were all against Mark Washington. So that he's kind of known for that. People think, they probably look at him and think he was some garbage corner, but he was a pretty solid cornerback. Next up, we have Houston. Houston in real life took running back Bill Dunsbury. He only played a year. So what we're going to give them is we're going to upgrade the receiver position. Remember, at this point, they still have Charlie Joyner. We're going to give them wide receiver Billy Parks. Billy Parks played for the 49ers. Nope, sorry, played for the Dallas Cowboys. He didn't play very long, but he was a solid receiver. He was part of the 71 Super Bowl team. Started for him. Had some big catches in the game. He had some big catches in the game that got him that Super Bowl against the Niners. So we're having him go to Houston. Next up, we have Green Bay. And Green Bay took defensive back Al Matthews, who played 8 seasons for Green Bay. Played 8 seasons in the NFL. Wasn't all for Green Bay. But didn't really have much of an overall. Wasn't a dominating. He wasn't worth our first 2 rounds. So we are going to give him a guy they took originally in the second overall pick in the real life, defensive tackle Mike McCoy. Again, McCoy had a journeyman career, but I think at this point it was worth taking. Next up, we have San Diego. San Diego took defensive tackle Tom Williams. He only played 2 years. So we're going to give him linebacker Dave Washington, who played almost 10 years. Washington actually played for... Oh, geez. I'm sorry. This one's going to slip my mind. Was it Houston? I apologize for this one. I forgot who Dave Washington played for. But he had a solid career, nonetheless. Washington, in real life, the next pick took... in real life, they took defensive tackle Bill Brundage, who, of course, we've already drafted away. So we're going to get him a guy who ends up being an MVP for him, ends up helping him win a Super Bowl. We're just going to put him there a lot sooner, and that's going to be kicker Mark Mosley. So next up we have Baltimore. We only have a few more picks left here. Baltimore in real life took defensive tackle Jim Bailey, who did play 9 seasons in the NFL as a journeyman role player. So we're going to upgrade their center position. They had Bill Curry still, but he wasn't going to play for too much longer. So we're going to give him center John Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was the trigger man in those infamous Dallas shotgun teams of the mid-'70s. So we're thinking with him there, maybe him, and then he'd be the center for Burt Jones down the road, and he'd play with John Unitas early. So he would have played with some good quarterbacks. Of course, he played with one of the great ones in Dallas as well. Next up, we have Detroit. Detroit in real life took tackle Ray Parson. He only played 2 seasons for him. We're going to give him a guy who, again, was more of a journeyman. He actually was on the 76 Raiders team. And then he played on those early Buck teams in the late 70s. Defensive end Pat Tomey. And he was a solid player. I mean, he wasn't anything great. Of course, we're getting here into the end of the draft. For us, at least. But he would have been a good fit for Detroit. Next up, we have the Jets. In real life, they took tight end Rich Castor here. Of course, we already had him go in the first round. So we're going to give them a position that would have been spot duty for him. Initially, he was taken in real life in the first round, and that was running back Steve Owens, the Heisman Trophy winner. He did have a couple of good seasons for Detroit early in his career, so we just look at him as he could have been that. He could have been a bridge between Emerson, Boozer before they get Riggins. Next up, we have Cleveland. In real life, they took Jerry Shirk here. Of course, we had Shirk. What was he, our 6th overall pick? And we're going to give him a guy who they took with the 3rd overall pick, and that's Mike Phipps. Now, I think coming in the second round, pick 21, Mike Phipps might have had a better chance in Cleveland. There would have been as much pressure. I mean, you traded away Paul Warfield, and the idea was to draft Mike Phipps. So now there was a lot of pressure. I mean, you're drafting away a Hall of Famer who at the time many considered. I mean, Paul Warfield was the best receiver in the game at the time, and I would put definitely in the top 10 wide receivers of all time. So Mike Phipps here, he might have had a better career for Cleveland. Next up, we have San Francisco. We just have 5 more picks to go here, folks. We have running back John Eisenberger. He only played 4 seasons for the Niners at running back. I went with linebacker Ken Geddes, who played for Detroit in the 70s. Solid linebacker for Detroit in the 70s. Next up, we have Dallas, who took wide receiver Margene Atkins. He played 3 seasons for Dallas. We're going to give him linebacker Doug Swift, who played for Miami. Swift was more of a role player on some of those 70s Dolphins defensive teams, the no-names, of course, but was a solid performer, good pass rush guy. Next up, we have Oakland. They took tight end Ted Coy. He played 5 seasons for them. We're going to give him running back Art Malone, who in real life went to Atlanta. Malone, I don't think he ever went over 700 or 800 yards rushing for a season. But you put him in a team that wanted to throw the ball down the field, he may have had a chance to actually have some good runs. He may have been able to get into the 900-yard range for a season. Okay, our last two picks are coming here. We got quarterback Bill Keppelman going to Minnesota. That is not who we're going to give them. We are going to give them defensive end Alden Roush, who in real life went to Denver. He played 9 seasons for Denver. He would not have played significant role for Minnesota, but he would have been a great guy to bring in when a defensive end, when Jim Marshall, when Carl Eller may have needed a break. And sometimes you can take those players, and he could have been moved into possibly even defensive tackle for that front four. And the final pick we have in real life, the Kansas City Chiefs, your world champions, took linebacker Clyde Warner. He played 7 seasons, but nothing of any significance. We're going to give him another guy that played 9 seasons. He went in the first round in real life to Buffalo, and that's linebacker Al Collins, who could also play defensive end as well if need be. Kansas City definitely needed linebacker help. I think Collins would have been a better selection than Warner. So that completes the second round, which completes our 70 redraft. I know. I hope it wasn't too boring. I know in the first round, I think I spent a lot of time, which I probably should. The second round, I didn't want to spend as much time with. Again, I think this could be better if I had someone else to feed off of, other than myself, just sitting here trying to give you kind of data on these guys. I'm not a stat guy, of course, but I've never been a stat guy. More of I look at players, I want to see their body of work, not necessarily based on stats, but how are they in the trenches? How can they lead the team down the field? Running backs, do they have that vision? Do they spot the hole where there's not a hole? Those types of things. So yeah, that's the 1970 redraft. I think next week, I'm going to mix it in for next week. I think I got it posted for Wednesday. The July 3rd is when I'm going to do the 1971 draft. The 1971 draft is already done. I'm actually working on 72 right now. I'm through the first round. I'm into this. I think I'm through the first round. I was on the very end of the first round of the 72 draft. Oh, I have 3 picks left to go in 72. Which that'll be a fun one. So again, in the 71, just to give you a little hint of what might be coming in 71. There was 4 Hall of Famers. That one, 71 is a pretty solid draft overall. I think there was more potential Hall of Famers in that 71 draft than they're giving credit. 72. So 71, your big names are going to be, you got Jack Ham, you got Jack Youngblood, Johnny Riggins, Dan Deerdorf. And then 72, that's the Franco Harris draft. Many people consider it one of the worst drafts of all time overall. I think some people may shock you where Franco Harris goes. So yeah, I hope this was enjoyable. It was enjoyable for me to do. I love looking back at NFL history. I like giving some players that people don't know or haven't heard of before. I like giving them their proper respect and due. These are guys that, just because they're not relevant now, doesn't mean they weren't relevant to the history of the game, because they were. All these guys I mentioned were good players. Some were great, some were Hall of Fame, but there wasn't one guy in here that wasn't a solid player. So again, I hope this was. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll do the 71 here probably next Wednesday if I can't get in early. I'll try to get in early if I can, and then I'd like to get that 72 done probably next weekend. But this was fun. I enjoyed this, and like I said, to the AFL, to my fantasy football owners, all of you are welcome to join me, and we could really have some fun with this. So, again, I'm going to end the stream now. For those of you who have watched or are going to be watching in the future, thank you. Please leave feedback to help me improve this. This is something, again, new. We normally do the fantasy stuff, which is based for our football league. So, again, thank you for those that are watching, and we'll see you for the 1970.